I'd like to call this Council and Budget Committee meeting to order. Madam Clerk, the roll call, please.
All members of council are present, your worship, with the exception of Councilors Butler and Luberts.
Councillor Luberts is in the building. He'll be here shortly. There are no announcements, no addendum this evening. Are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest? I have one, Madam Clerk, with respect to the item that relates to the Crystal Ridge Community Center grant, since I'm a member of the Ridgeway Lions Club, which is intimately involved with the Crystal Ridge Community Center. So when we get to that item in part 2, I will ask that it be dealt with separately. Councillor Passero.
Thank you, Worship. On a similar note, I'd like to declare a conflict of interest under Part 5, 5.1 for the Fort Erie Lions Senior Citizens Complex, as I'm a member of the Fort Erie Lions Club, which does maintain a majority of that board of directors.
Correct. So, Councillor, not when we get to those items, ask that they be dealt with separately. Are there any other disclosures of pecuniary interest? Evening, Councillor Butler. Okay, then I'm going to hand the chair over to Councillor Nutt, who is the chair of the Budget Committee.
Thank you, Your Worship. Starting off tonight, we have a presentation from Jonathan Jansen, our Director of Corporate Services. You can go ahead and take it away. His presentation will be on the screen.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome to the 2018 levy budget presentation. Note that a copy of the presentation has been posted on the town's website in advance of the meeting, should anyone wish to follow along. First off, a big thank you to our town staff that are heavily invested in this process and work together to serve the town. Our CAO, directors, managers in finance and payroll, staff dedicate a lot of time to this process and should be commended. The GL, or the General Levy budget process, this is the last of the 3 budgets that we approve in any given year. And in the presentation tonight, we will look at the background to the budget with some context from 2017. We'll look at the 2018 base budget and the MPAC, or Municipal Property Assessment Corporation assessment changes. Review the 2018 supplementary requests that Council will consider. Review the consolidated budget and impacts on the median household. We'll highlight risks and opportunities and look at multi-year forecasts. Outline the next steps for the budget. Review the order of recommendations, the majority of which are the supplementary requests that will be reviewed individually following the presentation, and respond to any presentation questions. The 2018 budget is guided by a number of key inputs. Council's corporate strategic plan is a major impact, and the related strat plan committee and champions continue to identify town initiatives. For example, a number of the key 2017 outcomes were funded by the 2017 budget, such as the customer service training and transit enhancements. Long-term financial planning. Beyond the current budget, the town includes 2 forecast years for operating, that being 2019 and 20, 5-year forecasts for water and wastewater, and 10-year forecasts for capital. Like all Ontario municipalities, the town is faced with aging infrastructure and uncertainty about a lot of different revenue sources. This requires strategic management of available funding resources. Council and staff have engaged in corporate studies such as the operational review a number of years ago and the organizational review 2 years ago, which provided feedback on the town's efficiencies and guidance on areas particularly with regards to staffing. Administrative report number CS 20-2017 in September started the process by giving context to the budget, including some of the known year-over-year changes at that point, in a reference to CPI, or consumer price indexing, at the time of 1.2% for controllable costs. Corporate and Community Services Subcommittee has had various budget discussions in the past few months with the aim to limit the total tax bill increase. For 2017, Council has canvassed for any process enhancements, documents, and community engagement improvements. for which the communications continue to be rolled out by our communications advisor. This graph just shows at a very high level the structure of the town's budgets. The three spheres are the general levy operations, capital, and the water and wastewater operations. The capital budget approves the asset spending of the town and funded primarily through reserves generated by the general levy. The water and wastewater budget is a full cost recovery program that delivers drinking water through our municipal drinking water license. And then tonight, the general levy operations, which consolidates the operating or the current year expenditures of the town, departments, boards, and committees to deliver all the services to the town. The $26 million levy budget is allocated by function in this chart based on the departmental areas that the province requires in its reporting annually. Here you can see the roads and transit comprise the largest share at 32%. This includes as well these funding areas, the external funding of the Economic Development Tourism Corporation, as well as our public library at approximately 5.7%. And about $200,000 annually goes to funding our future contribution towards the construction of a South Niagara Hospital. And that's just under 1%. So the total taxes that the town bills and collects for its services include that of the region and the province for the school boards as well. The town portion is $25.4 million from 2017 of the $58.7 million, or approximately 43%. The region portion is 42%. It applies to regional work such as regional police, regional roads, waste and recycling management, transit, public health, and social housing. Overall, the combined region and provincial amounts combine to approximately 56% of the total tax bill, or 57, sorry. By way of reminder, on the tax calculation, the total levy requirements are divided by the total weighted assessment to come up with a tax rate for the town. Property owners then apply this rate to the current value assessment determined by MPAC to calculate taxes owing. For comparison, we reference as a town the provincial study that looks at 150 municipalities across the province for like properties. The primary comparison for residential taxpayers is the detached bungalow, and this has been updated now for 2017, where Fort Erie has total taxes in the study of $3,222 for all components, which is below the average of $3,434. For all the other components or classifications, that being two-story homes, other types of homes, commercial and industrial properties, the town is notably below average for all of those. So this graphically shows the relative tax position of Fort Erie in that comparison group, with Fort Erie being the fourth from the lowest in that comparison. We always, as well, do a total municipal burden comparison, which this graph compares all Niagara for total amounts paid to a municipality, that being the tax and the water and wastewater or utility portions. This excludes Grimsby, which didn't report the numbers in time, as well as Wainfleet, which doesn't have a water and wastewater system, both of which have higher taxes than Fort Erie. So Fort Erie has relatively high water and wastewater costs and below average taxes, which when combined puts Fort Erie 4.2% above the Niagara average. This change over the last number of years is absolutely a result of the town's commitment to addressing the infrastructure gap. Council's strategic plan was approved in 2015. We were fortunate to have Bev present the highlights for 2017 on this last Monday night, along with the report, which contained detailed appendices on the accomplishments. So no further comments to mention there tonight. For 2017 financial performance, staff are reviewing all outstanding invoices and adjustments, such as accruals and encumbrances, throughout January, and will make final adjustments in the coming weeks. The town, we have controlled costs, maximized non-tax revenues, and managed projects that will have a levy surplus. Water and wastewater operations are anticipated to have a small variance for 2017. Looks like it will break even. With these results, allocations will then be made where required by statute or in accordance with town policy. The financial statements are audited by Grant Thornton in April and reviewed by the audit committee in May, to be presented to council in June, together with any recommendations of allocating surplus funds. Some key financial balances that relate to this budget for opening 2018 are a total levy debt of $4.9 million. The total, including the water and wastewater components, is $8.4 million. $6.2 million of levy operating reserves. That's the balance in the total reserves opening next year from what we have projected, or for 2018, such as the emergency management reserve, the Niagara Hospital reserve that we mentioned, the theater, which has been fully funded, and the levy stabilization reserve. $9.8 million is the total balance of capital reserves related to levy, and that is funded by a $5.9 million annual contribution. Transitioning into 2018, the base budget includes changes to revenues and expenses approved in previous budgets that are part of ongoing operations. The budget's driven by the cost to deliver services that the town currently delivers and expects to continue to deliver. The drivers are a key, a few of the general components are costs of the service delivery, asset maintenance. The capital budget provides for the replacement or betterment needs, but the ongoing costs of asset maintenance are provided through the operating budget. Administrative and overhead costs, and then all of these are offset as well by other non-tax revenues. Overall, the base budget is, as you'll see in the coming slides, increasing 1.43%, which is a 2.7 increase over 2017, less assessment growth reduction. For the reporting you have with that's been sent out in the annual budget binder, the information that we'll be looking at tonight is from CBC 07-2018, which highlights the changes in Appendix 1 for the base budget. And Appendix 3 contains all the reports by departmental areas for review. The details are in tab 7 of those budget binders. The reports include columns for 2017 year-to-date actuals as of the time of printing the reports, as well as 2017 approved budget, 2018 proposed budget, and the 2-year forecasts. The revenue categories included for the levy budget include the levies for both general tax and the BIAs, payments in lieu of taxes, donations, fines, grants, sale of land, and others. Expense categories include wages and benefits, materials and services, debt interest, grants, and partnership programs. There's a section then below that as well that relates to financing and transfers, which includes any internal allocations between cost centers, debt principal payments, as well as reserve transfers. The total base increase of revenues is $643,000 for 2018. These are all the items that are included in Appendix 1 to the report. Increases in tax write-offs of $41,000 are recommended after being postponed in 2017 due to the large shift to the residential base related to MPAC reassessments. Non-tax revenues such as building permits and cell tower revenue have increased $181,000. And provincial policy impacts include the Assessment Equalization Grant received through the Ontario Municipal Partnership Fund, or OMPF, which increased $500,000 approximately to $1.5 million in 2018. This will be addressed later in the supplementary and risks section as the funding isn't guaranteed. For 2018, 50% of the grant has been included in the base budget, and the remaining 50% proposed for one-time needs so as to minimize the reliance on that funding. Another provincial component is the provincial gas tax for transit, which has a small increase for this year of approximately $15,000. This chart shows the revenues by source with a breakdown of all revenue sources for the general levy operations. Taxation is 82%, and this is offset by other areas of interest, grants, user fees, gaming revenues, and other. The base budget has a net increase in expenses for 2018 of $1.8 million. It includes a decrease in debt costs that will be addressed later related to the maturity of Gilmore Road, Storm, and Road debt, an increase in estimated wages and benefits of $426,000, which supports all full-time and part-time employees, including both union and non-union, as well as volunteer firefighters, council, and committees, along with all Bill 148 impacts. Operating impacts listed in the capital budget that affect our operating budget are a total of $63,000. And the second year phase-in of a number of the 2017 supplementary items includes $160,000 for transit route expansion and $92,000 for approved staffing. Grants overall have a slight increase, which include the increases to the EDTC and library that were presented on January 10th. All other expenses have an increase of $1.2 million. This includes materials, supplies, insurance, fuel, street lighting, utilities, and transfers to reserves. The largest increase in this area is the 50% transfer of over $700,000 to reserves of the OMPF funding. The base budget is also adjusted to remove $523,000 of items that were approved in last year's budget that had only one-time impact. This includes the additional road resurfacing works that were done, grants for the Dominion Repertory Theatre, Crystal Ridge Community Center, the Royal Canadian Legion Branch 230, as well as the Snowbirds event. So this is the breakdown of expenses for levy operations by the type of expenses. Wages and benefits are the largest cost of municipalities and represent 43% of the town's budget. Materials and supplies represent 27%, followed by reserve transfers, grants, and debt charges. So these three areas or components, when combined, they result in an increase of $684,000 to the levy, or approximately 2.7%. This is not adjusted for the assessment changes, which we'll look at next. Here we have two components to the assessment changes year over year. First is assessment growth, which affects the town every year. The annual benefit taxpayers get from new development in the town and reduces the tax burden on existing taxpayers. The total growth for this year is 1.26%, which is a welcome reduction to the overall taxes of existing taxpayers and slightly larger than the 2017 assessment growth. The reassessment shifts result from impact changes that are done every 4 years. Property decreases are applied immediately, and any increases are divided equally to phased in over 4 years. The average residential phase-in for 2018 is a 2.39% increase. A big story for the 2017 budget was this shift that resulted from the from MPAC's reassessment. In 2017, the shift was over 3.5% from non-residential properties to residential properties. So if your assessment increase is less than the town average of 2.39%, your taxes will increase less than that presented tonight. Conversely, if it's more than the town average of 2.39%, your taxes will increase more than that presented tonight. The residential class in 2018 will only carry 0.05% more than other classes, so it definitely has dropped off to be more smooth following the reassessment year. The 2017 increase, just due to the assessment shift, was 3.71% actually. This table is a summary of the base budget with the effects of assessment growth and reassessment. So the bottom line is 1.43% for the base budget. So this is before we consider any other supplementary amounts. This is the amount at the bottom of Appendix 1, Column 2. So when we look at the median assessment of $191,500 for 2018, for all components for the base budget, it's a 0.36% increase, which is column 4 at the bottom of of Appendix 1. So this includes the regional impact and excluding any tax policy changes they have yet to make, which they're not proposing any or anything significant from what we understand, as well as draft provincial education rates that were released last month and are just pending legislation. We now move from the base budget to the supplementary items that are contained in Appendix 2 of the report. Supplementary budget items are submitted for enhanced services beyond the base level of service. This includes both one-time items as well as ongoing or new services. These are submitted as separate decision units for council consideration. Each item has its own supplementary request form in your budget binder package under tab 8. And these are broken into 4 categories. Parts 1 and 2 relate to items that have come forward to council from previous reports or resolutions. And parts 3 and 4 are new requests coming to council from earlier analysis. So the total of all Part 1 supplementaries, so these are ones that council has been made aware of in the past and are base or they continue indefinitely, is $410,000. $250,000 is the capital reserve allocation that was reported in the capital report in November of last year. This $250,000 is a reduction from the past number of years of $500,000 a year. We're expecting an updated asset management plan in the coming year once the related infrastructure master plans are completed, and this will result in an updated financing strategy that is more refined. The second one is an allocation to reserves of maturing debt in accordance with town policy of $135,000. And the last one is a $25,000 annual contribution to the museum capital reserve following the November presentation of the 6218 steam engine study for works related to stage 3. Part 2 is $740,000 of one-time costs, all of which are reserve funded, primarily from the OMPF funding mentioned earlier. $400,000 relates to the removal of dead ash trees that have been devastated by the emerald ash borer. This is proposed to be used with funds that were put aside in June of last year into the emergency management reserve. $100,000 allocation to the museum capital reserve, similar to the $25,000 annual. This one-time fund would be for stage 2 of the steam engine. $100,000 is proposed for an environmental impact study that came forward as a PDS report. And $40,000, which council saw on January 10th, is to go to EDTC related to the Smart Lab study. $25,000 request has again come forward, similar to last year's budget, to assist with the Crystal Ridge Community Center 2018 operations, and $75,000 is proposed for an industrial land development strategy. Part 3 contains $222,890 in base funding requests, $62,500 for a third van for specialized transit purposes, $30,000 for winter control for transit bus stops, $16,100 for the levy component of staffing costs for an engineering project manager, $42,600 for staffing costs of a new municipal law enforcement officer, $11,690 for staffing costs to convert 2 part-time recreation employees to full-time, $50,000 for additional rural ditching works, and $10,000 for Canada Day fireworks to bring the total funding to $20,000 and remove reliance on other funding partners. And finally, part 4 is $382,500 of one-time costs, again, all proposed with reserve funding, $30,000 for a pay equity review, $300,000 to contribute to the Niagara region for a long-term care facility at 200 Garrison Road, $12,500 for to fund the rescheduled Snowbirds event, and $40,000 for a rural speed limit study. So this table shows the impact of all 4 parts on the budget. The total of all these requests is, in terms of reliance on the levy, is $633,767, or 2.49%, for a total combined with all base and supplementary impact, if all were to be approved as shown, of 3.93%. This is found at the bottom of Appendix 2 in column 2. This graph shows the 5-year comparative tax levy increases for both the town portion in blue and the total tax bill in orange. The small lightly shaded 2018 bars show the base budget, and the darker bars at the far left show the impact of all supplementary items were approved. The dark orange bar shows the tentative total tax increase at the far left of 1.47%. The 2014 to 17 average is 5.4% for the town and 2.01% for the total tax bill. Again, during this time, the town's increase to capital reserves has been an impressive $2.2 million per year that cumulatively has been added to the levy. If this strategic levy were removed, the town's average increase for the same period would drop over 2%. So this is the total tax bill changes as presented result in a total tax bill increase of 1.47% for the median residential taxpayer. When shown as the total in dollars change over year, the total of all these changes is $50. Some risks associated with the budget. There are a number of federal and provincial legislations that do impact the town's budget. These ongoing risks affect a wide variety of areas for the town, such as Bill 148, employment impacts to costs and benefits and reporting requirements, added regulations such as the new asset management reporting requirements recently approved in December, follow the earlier tangible capital asset regulations that were released for the province, all of these without any associated funding sources available to the town. The OMPF funding is another one of those that isn't considered stable, as mentioned, and has been relied upon at 50%. The assessment appeals are subject to ongoing changes, particularly impacted by larger commercial and industrial properties. The new 2016 MPAC reassessment is drawing a new round of appeals and may impact the future assessment base and resulting tax write-offs. The budget includes the region's levy changes as approved. However, some decisions are still outstanding. This includes the tax ratios that determine how tax levies are distributed. And as mentioned, the effects of the Emerald Ash Borer continue to be reported on, but may need to be accelerated depending on the urgency and the liability related to that. Economic factors include interest rates, which impact both investment earnings and debt carrying costs. Inflation has risen substantially from the earlier guidance of 1.2% to more recent rates of 2% in December, and it's expected to rise based on forecasts for 2018. Utilities as well, under economic factors, have seen significant exposure to pressures, to rate pressures. Some legal matters involving the town remain before courts, and financial exposure beyond insurance coverage is a risk that we continue to monitor. And the infrastructure gap, as you've heard repeatedly, is an important provincial issue that may affect the town's ability to attract and be successful with future projects, depending on their requirements for funding that gap. AMO continues to proactively call on the province to come up with alternative ways of funding to relieve this. Again, just recently they released a video suggesting even more than the 3.84% that we had referenced in the past as an amount that the municipalities across Ontario would need to increase on average over the next many number of years. One of the ones they continue to put forward as their proposed solution is a dedication of 1% of HST to municipal infrastructure. Opportunities definitely include funding partnerships that we actively seek out. The grants oversight team meets regularly to monitor existing and upcoming opportunities. It's expected that additional infrastructure stimulus funding programs may be expanded or announced this year. For example, the town will be applying for the recently announced Community Transportation Grant Program to support expansion of transit services. The town's fees and charges consider the balance of burden between users of fees, such as facility rentals and permits, and the extent that the taxpayers support operations. There's an opportunity to realize an improved mix of residential, commercial, and industrial tax base to support the town, and some current initiatives focus on advancing that. The Canadian Motor Speedway project has significant potential impact on town resources that would have to be addressed as it progressed. And the $1.5 million theater contribution to the high school across the street has been fully funded by the town, and the commitment will be reduced by fundraising efforts, which would result in additional funding opportunities from that fund. For forecasts, the base increase, excluding any of the supplementaries that may be approved tonight, relates in increases of 2.3% for 2019 and 0.8% for 2020. The strategic capital reserve contribution should continue to mitigate the impacts of Ontario regulations for requirements. The collective bargaining agreement expires in 2020, so that's a forecasted item that provides some stability for the town. There are, again, additional annual debt costs of $260,000 that mature at the end of 2019. There are other forecast impacts, such as insurance and utilities that have been forecasted. And lastly, with regards to the 2019 budget, the preparation for that will be ongoing throughout 2018, but the reports and presentations to council will be delayed due to the timing of October elections. So coming to an end tonight has two components: the assessment analysis report, which is CBC 06, and the general levy budget report, CBC 07. Staff have scheduled January 31st as a follow-up budget meeting should council want more time to examine changes or make requests. The related levy and capital bylaw will be brought to council together on either February 12th or February 26th, depending on the timing of budget wrap-up. And as always, town staff are available to the public to provide further information to respond to any budget questions. Corporate Services does provide an annual budget book that has a wealth of information commenting on the budget and providing additional details. That's always a great resource to accompany these discussions as well. So the recommendations that follow will be recommendations in sections 1 to 4, which are all the supplementary items that will be considered separately. Part 5 is a listing of all grants which receive separate approval. Part 6 approves the BI levies, which require their own approval by council. Part 7, the total levy recommendation in the resolutions, and which will be updated by any changes that we discussed tonight. And Part 8 is just a standard one that council will recall is something in response to a provincial regulation just to exclude amortization from the budget. That's the end of my presentation. I turn it back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Jansen. Quite the riveting presentation. Are there any questions or comments from any council members? Councilor Luberts?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Jansen, just a few, probably more clarification than questions, but on slide 9, you talk about I think it was the burden, the tax burden. But I guess my question on that is, you said something about when you're doing the calculation, our infrastructure gap funding is included on our end, but there's other municipalities that don't do it. Is that what you were getting at? I guess my question is if we're contributing to an infrastructure gap, why don't we take that out when we're comparing the tax burden with other municipalities that don't?
Through the chair to Council Luberts. Right, it's a good point where I'm not saying that other municipalities are not addressing this issue. I just would want to stress that anecdotally, I think more so, we don't have a formal survey across the region that does focus on that particular issue, but we know that in our experience from some of the comparisons we do have, that what we're adding annually has been in excess of most others. So that just has definitely had a direct impact on our standing.
All right, thanks.
Councilor Luberts?
Well, I mean, the only reason I'm saying that is because the average person's going to look at this and say, we're third highest municipal tax burden. But there's other factors that play into it that may not play into it with other municipalities. So we might move down to our orange bar here, which is just average. If that factor is taken into consideration, so somewhere along the line, the infrastructure gap has to be addressed with other municipalities if they're not doing as much as we are. So I guess it's nothing we can really do about it, but I'm just curious as to, I'm worried about us being third and then we're not comparing apples with apples and oranges with oranges here. I guess that's my concern, but I guess slide 16, our maturing debt. I can vaguely remember some discussion about maturing debt over last term of council, and there was some times when we made some agreements to use maturing debt, and we didn't take that off our base budget. We continued on with it and put it into the infrastructure gap funding. I believe that's where we put it. But I see from slide 16, now we go to slide 25. Is that the same amount of money that we're putting in the capital reserves from the matured debt?
Yes, it is. We give council that ability to decide on whether they again do wish to do that. It's our recommendation that we, in accordance with policy, that we do that, but it is just to show that the town has an opportunity with the debt that is matured, and it is again requesting that it be transferred into capital. But you're right, it is the same amount.
Now, what happened to the agreement that we made last term that we would start using matured debt and put that into infrastructure gap funding? What happened to that?
That is, this request, 1.2 of the supplementary is responding to that request, so we are proposing that be done.
Yeah, but here it says we're putting it into the capital reserves. I thought we were just gonna put it towards infrastructure gap funding. I know what you're saying, we'll put it in the reserves and we use that reserves money to, but how does that get reported to the general public that we're increasing our infrastructure gap funding? I'm not seeing anything in here about that.
We would consider that allocation to be directly related to capital programs and to the addressing the infrastructure gap. The capital budget is funded largely by those same capital reserves. So by setting it aside into a capital reserve, it goes directly towards capital works.
Yes, I understand that, but how do we relate it to the general public that here's $135,000, we need to show them that we're shrinking the gap? That's what I'm trying to get at. How can we do that?
One of the numbers I reported on it for 2017 talked about the annual contribution from the levy to capital reserves. At the bottom of slide 11, the amount we're currently contributing is $5.9 million per year towards capital needs, which is part of what addresses the infrastructure gap. So that proposed increase would increase the $5.9 million to north of $6 million, directly related to reducing the gap. So I think we could do something in our communications to clearly say that this is part of addressing that infrastructure gap. Another slide we did show to summarize that issue was on slide number, bear with me one moment, slide 33, which does show the total of supplementary infrastructure-related contributions of 1.5%, and that includes the $250,000 strategic amount, the matured debt of $135,000. Actually, I think just those two amounts. So those two amounts, again, here are shown as addressing the infrastructure needs of the town.
Yeah, I see that, and again, what I'm saying is infrastructure gap isn't mentioned. That's the point that I'm trying to get at. Somehow we have to relate it to the general public that we are working on it and it is working, and here's what we've done. I understand what you're saying here. We all understand that sitting around here, but showing it to the general public so that they understand that, you know, we keep putting more and more money into reserves, and that's what they see. But we're shrinking the gap, and we're doing it strategically through using matured debt. Somehow we got to get that out there, because all they know is there's increases in our taxes, but not necessarily. It would be more if we weren't doing it this way.
That's a good point. I think we can make sure that when we're communicating as a follow-up to the budget, we can make sure that we highlight the component that does relate to addressing the infrastructure gap.
And slide 17. The increase, the library and EDTC services, $38,000. But there's an ask of $40,000 for the Deloitte study, right? For the Smart Labs study. But I see that's into the supplementary, but doesn't that affect this year number? Because EDTC is supplementary, is it not?
Yes, the way we've structured the presentation and the two appendices is to first deal with just the base amount. So the base component of the EDTC submission is for a portion of that $38,000. The additional $40,000 one-time request is part of the supplementary section. So that is the $40,000 is in addition to the amount that relates to the EDTC in that amount.
Okay, all right. And slide 23.
Mr. Jansen, as a point of reference, that amount, that ask, I believe you showed it as being funded through reserves, so there's no impact to the tax rate. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Go ahead, Councilor Luberts.
Slide 23. Just looking at we're calling this the median household, and 187,000 and 191,000. I've been paying little attention to real estate in this town, and the real estate prices have gone off the wall. And just in Crystal Beach alone, there's places that are going for astronomical amounts of money for something that, in my opinion, might not be worth that kind of money. How are we maintaining, because I see in this $187,000 as a median household in Fort Erie for, well, ever since I've been a counselor, it hasn't changed much from 187,000. Why is it that, is this the average cost of a home in this town? Because I find that hard to believe that that's still, that it's 187,000.
This is based on impact data that we receive in December of each year. And so in this case, it's not an average. The distinction for this, and we're mostly in line with other municipalities that use the same measure, but half of all Fort Erie residential properties for this property type are under that amount, and half of properties are above that amount. So I agree, it does, particularly in a rising market, does still appear to be low, but this is based on the data that Impact does provide us annually.
So the median household is not an average. Median household is the middle of the road.
That's correct.
You're either above or below, so.
Do you have any other
So it's not-
questions?
To me, it doesn't sound like that would be very accurate for somebody to compare their properties with, because this isn't an actual number. It's not a fact that you can base yourself on, is it not?
If you would have noticed as well, just one other comment to that, from our other comparisons, there are other comparative areas that include other types of homes. If you want to get into more details of this particular type of assessment, we do have Jillian Corney here who would probably be able to help me out with that. But this is the same metric that the town has used for many, many years in terms of being consistent and comparing year over year the same type of property.
Okay, thanks. And last but not least, slide 34. Just a quick question on, I think you said something about risk and opportunities. A risk, I guess, would be accelerating the ash borer or the ash tree removal. And what would cause us to accelerate? Why would we accelerate it more than what we're doing now? I think we're doing a good job now.
I agree, and we annually, Infrastructure Services is annually reporting back to council on the status of the trees. But we do realize that at some point, the issue could begin creating additional risks or liability issues that would cause us to want to accelerate that further. But we are doing a remarkable job, our Infrastructure Services group, of tackling that. And in fact, the supplementary this year as well does as well advocate for some staffing related to that for one time for this, so we can accelerate it further and make sure we're not being held up by our ability as a town to identify the needs.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Walsh, do you have any comment on that item that Councilor Luberts has raised about the risk?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a little bit of clarification on that. Although we are, as John says, doing a wonderful job on what we're doing so far, we are finding that the rate of death of trees and their decay is accelerating. So we may have to come back maybe through the year or into next year's budget season with an additional request.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Councilor Luberts has no further questions. Is there anybody else that has questions regarding the presentation? Councilor Butler?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a couple of things, comments actually, and just one question for clarification. through you to Mr. Jansen. You mentioned that we contribute to the Niagara South Hospital budget. How much was that again?
Through the chair to Councillor Butler, the town contributes right now $200,000 per year, which is just over or around 0.8% of our budget annually towards the future contribution to the construction of that hospital.
Councillor Butler?
Thank you, Mr. Jansen. And just a comment, Councillor Lubert's made a very interesting point with respect to page 9 and the removal of perhaps the gap funding for infrastructure. But the argument can be made that regardless, the realities are that we do contribute to it. And so would be prudent for us to show that regardless of the other municipalities not doing it. And so I would rather see it in than take it out, because then we're just misleading the public. But that's my comment. Thank you.
Just a follow-up comment on slide 9. Mr. Jansen, during your presentation, you also stated that Wainfleet is not in here because they do not have a wastewater. That's why they're not represented. And you said that Grimsby had not sent in their numbers yet. So again, we're missing a couple people due to some circumstances. Welland's not listed in there either. He said free to live in Welland. That's fine, Mr. Jansen. Is there, yes, thank you, Your Worship, for pointing out that Welland's not in there. Are there any other questions regarding the presentation from anyone? Thank you very much, Mr. Jansen. We'll go ahead and move on. Moving on to item B of the agenda, which is reports. CBC 06-2018. Can I have a mover? So moved by Councillor Zanko. Let's begin going through this report, and due to certain conflicts of interest that have been declared earlier, we'll just go through one section at a time, starting with part 1. Oops, sorry, yep. Sorry, a little ahead of myself there. That was actually 07 I was looking at, so. CBC 06-2018, the council receives report number CBC 06-2018 regarding the analysis of the 2017 assessment for the 2018 taxation year. And that was moved by Councillor Zanko. That report is on the floor for discussion, comment, or question. Seeing any? Seeing none, I'll call to question. All those in favor? That passes unanimously. Okay, moving on to report number CBC 07-2018, 2018 General Levy Operating Budget. Can I have a mover? Councillor Butler, thank you for moving. This is the one that I was speaking to that we're going to deal with one part at a time due to conflicts of interest that have been declared, and I'll identify those when we get to those sections. So starting with part 1, Your Worship.
Mr. Chair, I wonder if I could just ask some general questions with respect to Section 7, which is the general levy budget handout that we were provided. Gives us the breakdown department by department. I had spoken with Mr. Jansen beforehand. There was just some questions I wanted clarification on, if I might.
Yes, you may, Your Worship. Mr. Jansen.
So the first one has to do with page 9 of that Section 7, and that deals with community services. And I don't know if you've got that available, Mr. Jansen, or not. Page 9, Section 7, Community Services. And I note that the actuals for 2017 with respect to wages and benefits was quite a bit less than 2017. And nonetheless, it's being increased again in the budget for 2018. Same thing with respect to materials. You provided me some background as to explanation for that. I wonder if you could pass that on.
Mr. Jansen.
Certainly through you, Chair, to Mayor. There's a number of factors there. For 2018, we have the first full year of a digital services position that was added last year. I think that was saw some savings, or in terms of the timing, may have had some impact on last year. But then for 2018, in both the wages and benefits and materials and services, there's amounts included for the election for this coming year. You'll see the impacts of that have a reduction down below. If you look in the shaded column for 2018, down at transfers from reserves, that increase for 2018 is to fund those increases in wages and benefits and materials and services with our reserves. The town annually puts aside an amount into an election reserve to fund this every fourth year.
If I might, Mr. Chair.
Yes, you may,
On
Your
the-
Worship.
On the following page, Mr. Jansen, there's this information relative to transit and crossing guards, and I presume that these numbers relate primarily to transit. And I note that the budget for 2018 is significantly higher than for 2017 relative to material and services. I presume that that relates specifically to the expansion of the transit service that we've provided in town.
Mr. Jansen?
You're correct. Early in our budget guidance, we had noted the phasing in impacts of the transit expansion that was approved last year. As well, it was highlighted in Appendix 1 for this year, so that is the largest share. Crossing guards happen to be one as well, although you're correct, it is more minor in terms of the total amount. It is impacted as well by Bill 148.
And the transit service budget would include the service that we also pay for in terms of transit between Fort Erie and Niagara Falls?
Yes, that's right. It includes specialized transit, conventional transit, and intermunicipal.
So just looking at this one specific item, we're talking just under 2% of the levy, an increase from, 888 to 1,212,000. That's maybe 1.5%, or maybe actually a little more than 1.5%. So I think it's important for the public to appreciate that that expansion of transit has a big portion of the increase this year in our budget. But it's a much-needed service, and I fully support it. If I could, Mr. Chair, move Mr. Jansen to page 21. Which relates to planning and development services. And again, last year's budget compared to actuals, quite a large difference. This year's budget is larger than the amounts last year, but doesn't necessarily reflect the actual experience. But we had discussed that, and I believe there's some anticipated potential changes with respect to revenues on this side.
Mr. Jansen?
The discussions on non-tax revenue in the planning and development services area, the analysis or the trends or the belief we had with those is that they would not be sustained in the long term. That certainly we were benefiting from some additional growth and development now, but that the levels we're at currently weren't expected to continue. So we could be more aggressive if we chose to be on these types of revenues. The risk with that is that future budgets would have to then adjust as well the opposite way. So part of our strategy in looking at that is to base it on a longer term average or trend. And then we know that with some of these areas, based on what we're seeing already going into 2018, that we would expect to potentially see some surplus in those areas, but that there's a number of reserves that would benefit from any kind of excess for those areas.
You are an accountant by training. So you're conservative by nature. And as you pointed out, in the event there's another boom year with respect to revenues in the planning department, those will go into reserve funds, which can be utilized for expenses in the future. If I might, Mr. Chair, I have,
You may, Your Worship.
with respect to page 41, which is community grants, just a little bit of clarification with respect to what that means and what the actual budget implication is for that particular item.
Yes, community grants includes the annual contribution to the business areas for the floral watering grants. The largest component of this, though, is the contribution we're budgeting towards the Greater Fort Erie Secondary School Theater. But you'll notice, in terms of, you'll see a large change in the grant expenditure, but that is offset by funding entirely from reserves. So the bottom line net revenue or expenditure for community grants is only the $28,000 that relates to watering grants.
So that's the budget implication, which is about 0.1%.
That's right.
And if I might, I don't know if you have section
Yes, Your Worship.
11, which deals with reserve funds. And the first page there, relative to the theater, DSBN GFest Theater, has that $694,000 number, which relates, I presume, to the transfer from reserves. And conceptually, can you explain to me what this means, what this $694,000 means? So it's coming out of a reserve to fund an expense that we've incurred?
That's correct. The amount itself is the agreement with the school board was structured so that we would pay $500,000 after the first conditions had been met in 2017. So that is an amount we are accruing with 17. And then the remaining portion, the $1 million, which combined with last year's $500,000 is $1.5 million, is now being reduced by confirmed fundraising amounts as of the end of the year. So it's just amounts received from what we understand from through the agreement, so that the amount itself is being reduced already. So at the end of the year for that reserve, you'll note that we are projecting to have remaining funds already to be used for other purposes. But that $694,000 is the amount coming into the other page you referenced.
Right, and so as monies are raised for that theater through the various fundraising activities, that reduces the municipality's liability and reduces the obligation that we have to pay money from our coffers. Thank you. And then if I might, just one last question, Mr. Chair. Going to page 1 of section 7, the general revenue fund overview. And I noticed that the general levy amount that's being budgeted at the top of page 1 is $25,900,000 and change. And yet in the resolutions that we're being asked to pass this evening, the general levy figure is $26,720,000, or net of the supplementary budget, $26,087,000. Why is there a discrepancy?
The difference on that line relates to the fact that general levy in this case also is net of some tax adjustments that we budget for. So we budget, in addition to the levy we budget to collect, we also budget supplemental taxes received throughout the year, as well as tax write-offs, which we've reported to council recently on. So that general levy line, if you were to expand that one line, you would see the levy portion that does agree to the amounts proposed, and then an offsetting amount of, I believe, approximately $150,000 of offsetting tax-related adjustments.
Wouldn't it be, isn't there some place in these budget documents where we could reflect that?
I think that's a good point on page 3, the taxation one. I think what we could do going forward is to expand that node, and you would see some of those components with more detail.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This, I want to compliment you, Mr. Jansen, and your staff. This is very comprehensive. This has followed a long process that the Corporate Services Committee has been involved in over the last several weeks, and I think you've done an excellent job.
Thank you, Your Worship. Are there any other questions or comments from counselors? Okay. Seeing none, we'll move on to part one. That council approves the following supplementary base budget funding for 2018, subject of previous reports resolutions. Item 1.1, 250,000 for capital reserves strategic investment. Is everybody comfortable just voting on these one at a time as we go through them? In case there's any changes, that way it's easier for the Director of Finance to capture. Okay, so we'll move item 1.1. Can I have a mover? Okay, we don't have to move it, it's already on the floor, okay. So let's, since it's already been moved and put on the floor, part one, we'll discuss item 1.1, 250,000 for capital reserve strategic investment. Councilor Passero?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I could direct a question through you to our Director of Infrastructure. The second paragraph under program benefits speaks to the asset management plan being updated. What is the timeline for that to take place?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we'll be retaining a consultant hopefully by April. Utilizing the updated master plans that we have at our disposal. We will have core infrastructure, which is roads, sewers, and water infrastructure. We should have a report by December of this year.
Councilor Passero?
Thank you for that, Mr. Chair. We've all gone through all of the pages. We know where the number is going to end up at the end of the day. But I think in some situations where staff have given us an alternative, I'd like to move an alternative just for council's consideration. If some of us are not comfortable where that final number adds up, and we'd like to deliver a little bit of relief to the taxpayer, I'd like to put an amendment on the floor that we put this dollar value at 0 for the current year. If I could speak to that quickly, Mr. Chair.
Yes, go ahead, Councilor Passero.
Just given the fact that we've, as noted earlier, I think we've put more away than any council in history as far as 2.2 million in increased capital investment. I know we're not fully home yet. We're probably not even halfway home yet. But given some of the increased pressures that are being faced out there by residents, I'm wondering if this is just an opportunity to take a pause, wait for the new asset management plan to come out that would drive future budget considerations with some actual numbers as to what we need to achieve. And that's just my thought process. I mean, I could argue on either side of this, but I think I'd like to just put that forward for council's consideration and see where it ends up.
Comments or question on Councilor Passero's amendment? Your Worship, she's deferring to you.
We had this debate 3 years ago. We talked about, I think at the time it was $400,000 or $500,000, and it was something that was started by the previous council. And it's true that it is building, we are building up reserves to deal with the infrastructure gap. I can't think of, well, I would say one of the most popular things we've done during this term of council is try to fix as many roads as we possibly can, because the roads in the town do require work. That's above ground, people drive on it, that's visible. We have lots of other infrastructure, storm sewers, ditching, that type of thing, so that I think it's tempting to take this because it's essentially is 1%. It's 1% on the budget, and it's tempting to take a look at that. But remember 3 years ago, I didn't think we needed to put in $500,000, and I don't think anybody agreed with me then. I think everybody thought that, yes, we did need to put $500,000 in. And it's true that we are making strides towards dealing with this issue. But if one looks at the statistical performance information that we also received as part of our budget package this evening, we are not ahead of the crowd by any sense of the concept relative to where we are with reserve funding in terms of our budget, so that it's tempting to say that we should give a break. We're going to be around 1.47%. If we're looking for some other areas to find some savings to reduce this, one of the ones is one that I just questioned Mr. Jansen about, and that is how we treat the revenues that we're getting in planning right now. You know, there's money there that I think we're kidding ourselves as to how much we're going to get. We are going to get more than we've budgeted for. So there's actually some money there. I don't know whether there's $150,000 or $200,000 that we could probably adjust there if we're looking to find $250,000. That would have no impact on the work that we're doing in terms of asset management. But I think we've got some momentum with respect to this. I would hate to see us lose that. I'm all in favor of not paying more taxes. Everybody is. But I'm thinking that we've made the commitment on this, and I think it's easier for us to continue with our commitment, because the next council may not put this back in if we take it out. So that I think we should maybe continue on. At least that's what my thinking is.
Councillor Butler?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm glad that the mayor spoke with respect to this, because I agree wholeheartedly. I think we would be traveling down a dangerous road if we were to eliminate that. So I would not be supportive of taking that out of the budget. And I agree, we want to lower taxes for everybody, but at what cost when everybody is screaming to have their roads done? And, you know, there's always situations in the middle of winter. I see infrastructure working hard in the middle of the night and on holidays, fixing things that shouldn't actually happen. And I think that it would be prudent for us to support infrastructure and keep that budget line.
Thank you, Councillor Butler. Councillor Libertson, I'm going to come to Councillor Zanko, then I'll come back to Councillor McDermott.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just going back to last term of council when we introduced this funding, the yearly amount that was requested by staff was the $500,000, but it was told to us that that's just a target number, so that we could work with it. We could reduce it in years that that we needed money for other things, but the decision was made that we would do it. And I know that our former Director of Finance spoke on this issue with other councils as well, and this wasn't something new to the previous council. But finally, we made the decision that, yes, we would go ahead with it. And so we didn't put the $500,000 in every year, as well as we're not going to do the same thing this year. But at least we're contributing. So taking it away completely would be, you know, we've gone 2 steps forward. Let's not take 1 step back. Let's continue on with funding it, and let's work towards, you know, seeing if we can contribute that $500,000 1 year or 2 years in a term that staff has recommended in the first place. I don't know that I want to eliminate it completely, even for 1 year. The gap needs to be reduced, and even what we're contributing isn't putting a huge dent in the gap that's been identified. So I'm thinking we continue putting towards it, and I think we work towards building up of that 500,000.
Councillor Zanko?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, I just agree with my colleagues. I do appreciate what Councillor Passero is attempting, because we certainly all want to decrease this number, but I certainly can't support a decrease to infrastructure. We all have several roads. We all receive numerous complaints about the condition of our roads that need repair. I'm happy that we've been able to advance even some design work, but I think we should contribute at a minimum. Continue to contribute the $250,000 annually. And I do agree with Councillor Luberts that my goal essentially would have been that we could be in a position to contribute even more.
Thank you. Councillor McDermott?
Yes, well, I agree with the concept that Councilor Pacero is bringing forward, but it doesn't look like it has much traction around the horseshoe. But I think tonight, we really should try and get this lower, and whatever mechanism that gets us there. I do think that the taxpayers do deserve a break. I think every so often we have to be a little bit compassionate because we have moved quite fast for the taxpayer, and in a positive way. But I still think that we can do better, a little bit better here tonight, and I hope we work toward that end.
Thank you. Councilor Pacero?
Yeah, just to wrap up, I appreciate those comments, and if I was speaking, I'd probably say the same thing, but I think it's much better that we just had that quick discussion because I think that gives more to the rationale as to why we're doing this than just simply putting some hands up. They say, a picture tells 1,000 words, unless it's a bar graph in a finance department presentation, because it's not always the worst thing to be on the right-hand side of a bar graph. Sometimes it's forward thinking, it's forecasting challenges, and sometimes you do have to be ahead of the curve, even if it's viewed in kind of a negative light to get where you're going and need to be. So I appreciate that conversation, and nothing lost. I just wanted to make sure that got on there. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Councilor Pacero. I'll call the question on Councilor Pacero's amendment. All those in favor? All those opposed? That motion is defeated. Moving on to item 1.2. Oh, I'm sorry. Right, we do have to go back and approve that item. So 1.1 for 250,000. Does anyone wish to speak to this? No, everyone just had their fill? Great. Okay, I'll call the question. 1.1, 250,000 for the Capital Reserve Strategic Investment. That passes. Moving to item 1.2, 135,877 for capital reserves from matured debt increase. Any questions, comments? Your worship?
Question with respect to the long-term implications. So up until this year, the town was paying $135,000 on a debt. Now the debt's been paid, so every year going forward, that $135,000 is going to go into reserves. To assist us to build up our reserves and to deal with our infrastructure gap.
Yes, you're right. This has the same effect as the $250,000. That's why in the table we did present it as a combined 1.5%, because the effect on the infrastructure gap is identical with these two amounts. We've proposed to direct these specifically back to the related reserves that or cost capital needs areas that they were originally funding, but that is the same effect.
Your worship?
Oh, I'm good, thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? That item passes. Item 1.3, 25,000 for museum capital reserve, 6218 steam engine, stage 3. Comments or questions? Councilor Pacero?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just looking forward to second-year forecast and third-year forecast. The numbers reflected there at the 25, that's just showing that 25 will be coming in those budget years based on our base allocation this year. Is that correct? That's not forecasting an additional base allocation. Okay. So I just put it out there that if someone's around this table next year, I think it would be prudent to do another base budget increase by 25. If we can do that 3 years in a row, it takes our length of term to get this money down from 16 years to 6 years, whereas if we just do 25 and write it out. So I just make that comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions regarding this? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? That item passes. We're going to move on to section part 2 now. The council approves the following supplementary one-time funding for 2018, subject to previous reports/resolutions. Can I have a mover for part 2? So moved by Councillor McDermott. Starting off with item 2.1, 400,000 for emerald ash borer tree removal, funded by the Emergency Management Reserve. Your worship?
Can I just ask a question with respect to this item? Do we also have an amount in our capital budget to deal with this? In other words, is there something more than $400,000 that we've allocated for this year?
I don't believe so, but perhaps Kelly could confirm that.
There is, this is an amount over and above our, the amount we have in our current operating account.
That is how much? So we're putting close to $600,000 this year. And that was what we did last year, was it not? Which I think it's important for the public to get an appreciation of the magnitude of this issue. These are just public lands that we're dealing with here. These are just our road allowances and our parks. And many, many people are aware of what the implications are for their own personal property. I've known people, particularly in Crescent Park, that have had whole yards of trees that they've had to remove. So it is a serious problem, and I think it's prudent. I think that we're well ahead of the game with respect to this, although, as Mr. Walsh has indicated, this thing could blow up even more quickly than it has. So I'm supportive of this.
Thank you, Your Worship. Any other comments or questions? Councillor Passero?
Just two briefly through you to our director. We currently also have still in the base budget a dollar amount for replanting. Is that correct?
Mr.
Chair,
Yep.
yes, that's correct.
Walsh?
We spend about $25,000 per year right now on replanting. Replanting is a lot cheaper than cutting them down. We are looking at a program for the spring that's included in our base amount already, where we're going to be giving trees to our residents, and they'll be planting them on private property, and that will help with the reforestation of Fort Erie.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Councillor Passero?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And then just a brief note, you know, even though on paper it's showing that this coming out of Emergency Management Reserve, we had already preloaded that reserve with this money. So we're not going to be at a net loss at the end of the day when we take this money out. So thank you.
Are there any other comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor of 2.1? That passes. Moving on to item 2.2, $100,000 for Museum Capital Reserve 6218 Steam Engine Stage 2, funded by the General Levy Rate Stabilization Reserve. Comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? That passes. Moving on to item 2.3, $100,000 for an environmental impact study funded by the GLRS. That's a General Levy Rate Stabilization Reserve. Comments or questions? Councillor Passero?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is the first of two, what I believe are very important items accomplishing our industrial land strategy. It's been talked about for several years, and I think we're finally well on our way to taking some action on years of studies that have been done, sat on the shelf, and it's finally time to make some progress. So I think with the accomplishment of this one, and one that I think is one or two away, we'll actually get some tangible information that we can act on in the years ahead.
Thank you, Councillor Passero. Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? That passes. Moving on to item 2.4, $40,000 for Economic Development and Tourism Corporation Smart Lab study funded by the General Levy Rate Stabilization Reserve. Comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? That passes. Moving on to item number 2.5, which the mayor has declared a conflict of interest on. It's $25,000 for the Crystal Ridge Community Center grant funded by the General Levy Rate Stabilization Reserve. Comments or questions? Councilor Passero?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I could just ask our CAO for a quick update as to where those conversations stands and the timeline of that completion for facility assessments and the lease renewal.
Yes, Mr.
Through you,
Cookett?
Chair, to the Councillor. We have been waiting for the facility review since November. I don't know if I've mentioned this prior, but we had hired a consultant to do those on all our facilities. Unfortunately, the gentleman that was conducting the assessment was in a bad car accident, so the consultant has had to get another employee onto it to complete it. We're hoping to have it at the end of this month. Once I have that in hand, then I'll be able to meet with the Crystal Ridge Community Center and review the capital requirements along with the lease renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Cookett. Mr. Passero? Councilor Passero?
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Are there any other comments or questions regarding this? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? That passes. Moving on to item 2.6, $75,000 for industrial land strategy funded by the General Levy Rate Stabilization Reserve. Comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? That passes. We will now move on to part 3, which is that council approves the following supplementary base budget new funding requests for 2018. Can I have a mover? Councilor Zenko, thank you for moving that. We'll begin with item 3.1, $62,500 for specialized transit, a third fast van. Comments or questions? Councilor Passero?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a clarification, this is a base budget increase. I'm just looking for the correlation as to why it's only being done for the 1 year. How does that translate into the future? Is that because we're going into a RFP process?
Mr. Walsh?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's exactly correct, Councillor. 2018 is the final year of our contract with the Canadian Red Cross. So through the course of this year, we will be issuing an RFP that will determine the level of service, or we will determine the level of service, and the costs will be budgeted for next year.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm happy that this is going in as base and not supplemental, even though it's one time, because it will give us the resources next year to have some better conversations when those RFP numbers come back and levels of service and enhancements. Thank you.
Are there any other comments or questions? I'd just like to make a quick comment and thank everyone for this being part of the budget. I know that this van will help residents on the outliers of the community, especially in Stevensville, Crystal Beach area, help them get to their much needed appointments, whether it be through physical therapy or social therapy. So I'll call the question. All those in favor of 3.1? That passes. Moving on to item 3.2, $30,000 for transit bus stops winter control. Comments or questions? Seeing none, go ahead, Your Worship.
Just wanted to point out that this, although this isn't supplementary for this year, it's my understanding that going forward, it's going to be in the base budget, because this will be an ongoing obligation. Is that correct, Mr. Jansen?
Yes, that's correct. In fact, the amount in future years is greater than this. It'll have a phasing in effect.
Thank you, Mr. Jansen. Thank you, Your Worship, for bringing that up. I was also going to mention that this is a new service that's being offered to the community. It's not one that we currently do. With all the new transit stops, it's definitely something that's necessary. I'll call the question. All those in favor? That's passed unanimously. Moving on to item 3.3, $16,000 for engineering wages and benefits. Comments or questions? Councilor Passero?
I'm thrilled to see this because this gives us some extra capacity. We've said for well, we've said year after year, especially when we have infrastructure funding that comes down, if only we had a couple more shovel-ready projects. We have a list of projects we know need to be done, but we just don't have the resources to get them ready to go. So I definitely think this will assist us in making sure that we're ready to take advantage of any funding that comes down.
Thank you very much, Councillor Passero. Are there any other comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? That passes. Moving to item 3.4, $42,600 for the municipal law enforcement officer wages and benefits. Comments or questions? Councillor Zanko?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Mr. Cookett, just a question. And I guess a comment. I'm happy to see additional law enforcement, but I also wanted to just clarify a lot of the issues that we have during the summertime with regard to noise bylaws not being met, specifically directed towards short-term rentals. Is the intention with the additional bylaw enforcement to have the additional staff be able to kind of monitor that and be present during after hours and peak times to provide additional enforcement?
Through you, Chair, that's absolutely correct. So this new individual would be on a schedule that is typically Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday to take care of that weekend, those weekend issues. So that's our thinking at this point.
Go ahead,
if I
Councillor
may.
Zanko.
And what about after hours? I think it's great that during weekend hours we'll have enforcement, but typically when it comes to noise bylaws, it is after business hours.
Through you, Chair, to the councillor. That is correct, and typically if we're aware or we've received complaints, then we will put bylaw officer on call or ask them to do a rotation of nights, so they shift their hours, so we can address those issues.
Excellent, thank you.
Councillor Passero?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Monday night, we approved a bylaw that also added 2 positions within our town with the ability to enforce bylaw and winter control. And I think that in combination with this will go a long way, because currently we have one of our 2 bylaw staff at any given time working overnights or evenings when there are snow events, and that decreases the number of hours they have elsewhere in the week to do the services they're really supposed to be doing. So I think what we did Monday night, plus the addition of this, will really allow us to get some traction going forward on these issues. Nobody should have to live with a neighbor who's got 3-foot tall grass and 7 vehicles in the yard, and we're just struggling to keep up. I think this will really make a dent in that.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? That passes. Moving on to item 3.5, $11,690 for recreational wages and benefits. Comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? That passes. Moving on to item 3.6, $50,000 for rural ditching. Comments or questions, Your Worship?
Just a question with respect to where we are in terms of the monies that were allocated for 2017 with respect to this.
Mr. Walsh?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We are about 50% spent on those. The contracts were issued late in the year. The money is allocated to be spent as soon as we get through winter here.
Your Worship?
And I'm thinking that there's no end of rural ditching that needs to be done. That be a fair statement?
I wholeheartedly agree, and I think it's extremely accurate. Mr. Walsh, we'll get the expert opinion from you.
I'll agree with the mayor on this one.
See, that customer service training really has been working, Mr. Cook.
It has paid off.
Yeah, so even though we haven't spent what we allocated last year, this is one of those areas where I think if we pursue this aggressively, we'll be able to spend that easily, because and this goes to the whole issue of drainage and the number of complaints that we receive, particularly in rural areas. So I'm supportive of this, and hopefully it'll have an impact this year.
I hope so as well. One point of note, when we were discussing this earlier, Mr. Walsh did indicate that although there was some lag time on our attention to the CRMs, that we have made some progress towards that. Do you have any other comments you wish to make at this time regarding our conversation around that, Mr. Walsh?
I'd just like to reinforce the statistics that have come out since we bought our Great All about 8 or 9 years ago. Our CRM wait time has dropped from 7 years. We're down to addressing stuff within about a year and a half now. So market improvement, primarily due to the availability of ditching equipment available all year long.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Councilor Passero?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Mr. Walsh, we've had several conversations over the last couple of years of certain neighborhoods where ditching has taken place. And I know that at council chambers many times we've talked about maybe looking at how we perform ditching, especially in areas of subdivisions or condensed housing. Where do we stand on those conversations as far as moving away from a one-size-fits-all approach as far as the types, depth, length of ditching that we're doing in front of homes?
Mr. Walsh?
Through you, Mr. Chair, based on not only your and my conversation, but conversations I've had with Councillor Nutt and the mayor in particular, we are taking a good look and minimizing what we have to do in there to meet the requirements in urban areas. In rural areas, this 50,000 will be primarily allocated towards contractors where we can get efficiencies in very long runs of ditchings. Part of my manager of roads and fleets, one of his goals this year is to develop a ditching master plan, roll out a program for the next 5 years, so that we're not addressing issues willy-nilly. But there's a concentrated level of attack on it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And having heard that, I'm hoping that one of the benefits of the increased rural ditching is creating that capacity in those rural areas so we don't have to go as deep in some of the more urban areas, which is currently what we're doing because we just haven't been able to get ahead of things. And given the recent storms we've been having, that really has been our only option, is to do things as deep as possible because there wasn't any capacity in the system. So I'm looking forward to this maybe making a small dent in addressing those issues on a larger scale.
Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? That's passed. Moving on to item 3.7, $10,000 for Canada Day fireworks. Comments or questions? Councillor Passero?
Just some very brief background and rationale. The last few years, we have gone to different funders, organizations, community groups who have applied for grants. Given the grant cycle and the timing of how the federal and provincial government works, many times we don't hear back until the middle to the end of May. And given Canada Day is probably the #1 day for fireworks celebrations, we have been fortunate to be working with a company that has really penciled us in, but has been consistently asking week after week, is the money going to be there? Is the money going to be there? And we technically can't book it because we don't have all the money in hand. So this will allow the municipality to ensure that there is a fireworks show every year, regardless of any external factors or funding. We do have groups that would like to continue to contribute some funding. We look to bolster some elements of the fireworks show on Canada Day utilizing those funds, but it would be done on a year-to-year basis given the funds available. Having the municipality take control of this also allows us to possibly enter a multi-year contract, get better pricing, and allows us an HST rebate, which ensures that we can do a lot more with $20,000 than an external group could do. We've got some exciting things planned for the fireworks show, but we need to start planning in January, February. We can't wait until the middle of May. So this will go a long way to making sure that we can do that every year. We're not just any town on Canada Day. I mean, given the War of 1812, the sesquicentennial of Battle of Ridgeway, this is where it started. We should be putting our best foot forward that evening, and I'd appreciate council support so we can get working on this.
Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? That passes. Moving on now to part 4. The council approves the following supplementary one-time new funding request for 2018. I have a mover for part 4. Moved by Councillor Zanko. Item 4.1, $30,000 for pay equity review funded by, through the General Levy Rate Stabilization Reserve. Comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Item's passed. Moving to item 4.2. $300,000 for Niagara Regional Long-Term Care funded from the General Levy Rate Stabilization Fund Reserve. Comments or questions? Councillor Passero?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Although this is just coming to us now because it's time to give the money, this was a conversation we had way back when discussions were taking place. And I'm very proud that we put these dollars forward. It helped to bridge a gap and assist in conversations between the region and the landowner. I don't know what would have happened had we not pledged this money, but I'm glad that we did. And I think that the 7 people around the Horseshoe, as well as staff who supported us in this, can take as much credit in that new long-term care facility being in Fort Erie as anybody else. So I thank council for that support.
Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? That passes. Moving on to item 4.3, $12,500 for the Snowbirds event funded by the General Levy Rate Stabilization Fund. Comments or questions? Councillor Butler?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It says that we're looking at a special visit in September 2018, but have we shored up an exact date for that? Is it during Labor Day weekend or?
Mr. Cookett?
Through you, Chair, yes, we have. I'm just not sure what the date is, but they have confirmed a date with us. Is it? I didn't think so either, but I could get that date for you if you'd like.
Any other questions, Councillor Butler?
Yes, thanks. I was just curious because it would make sense to me that it would be on a long weekend as opposed to a shorter weekend, but obviously it's not, right?
We're at their mercy.
Councillor Passero? I'm sorry, actually, Councillor Butler, do you have anything else? You're welcome. Councillor Passero?
Just to aid in Councillor Butler's inquiry, we're really at the mercy of a very tight schedule amongst their training and their event dates. And just as an added note, the first time they were supposed to be here, it was on a Tuesday or a Wednesday. So it's not necessarily a weekend. It's whenever they can squeeze us in amongst their other commitments. September 19th is the date I've been whispered.
Are there any other questions or comments? Okay, seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? That item passes. Moving on to item 4.4, $40,000 for a rural speed limit study funded from the General Levy Rate Stabilization Reserve. Comments or questions? No, none of this is going to pay the mayor speeding tickets on those roads. Are there any comments or questions? Seeing none, I'd just like to make a quick comment and just thank everybody. The rural roads, especially in Stevensville, and as you go out towards Port Colborne, are a plethora of different speeds. There's no really rhyme or reason why one's 50, 160, 170, one's 80. So I know that the residents of the area are very excited to see this happening, and hopefully that we'll get to some kind of nice standardization and where everybody has a set expectation on what those road speeds should be, and you won't get run over by a blue Cadillac traveling at 110 down Point Avenue Road.
So your expectations may be a little high. But no, I think you're absolutely correct. And it's easier for people if they have an understanding throughout the municipality what they can anticipate in terms of speed limits. And it's going to be easier for the police to enforce as well. So I think it is good because we've had we've had a bit of a hodgepodge. And if you travel through the rural area of this community, as you know, there are different speed limits and some of the roads are exactly the same. So it doesn't make much sense. So this should be good, and I'm very much looking forward to it so that I can adjust my attitude.
Thank you very much for your cooperation, Your Worship. Moving on to part 5. Oh, wait, yes, I'm sorry. We'll call to question 4.4. All those in favor? That item passes. Moving on now to part 5. Council approves the following grants for 2018, starting with 5.1, which is $23,750 for the Fort Erie Lions Senior Citizens Complex. Comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Just so everyone knows, this is the item that Councilor Passero had a conflict of interest in. So that item passes unanimously. Moving on to item 5.2, $28,000 for business area watering. Comments or questions? Councilor Butler?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This item is very important for the beautification of the downtown areas and the flowers that are put up by the business improvement areas and the associations. The watering budget is desperately needed. It's difficult to find someone to water those plants, so appreciate it if my colleagues vote in favor of that.
Thank you, Councilor Butler. Are there any other comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? That passes unanimously. Moving on to item 5.3, $19,235 for Beachcomber Seniors Complex. Comments or questions on item 5.3? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? That item passes. Moving on to item 5.4, $1,000 for the Fort Erie Horticulture Society. Comments or questions? Councilor Passero, and then Councilor Butler. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to say, we deal with a lot of money in the millions, and then we get to something that's 1,000, and it's easy to skip over it. But I just want to thank these individuals. They helped do the plantings at the Kinsman Pool. The last 2 years that we've done our Party on the Patio fundraiser, they've done all the centerpieces for us. So this $1,000 does go a long way within the community, and I'm happy to support it once again.
Your Worship?
I just wanted to echo that because I noticed in the information that we received, there's a number of places where they're doing work. It's all volunteer, and so this is certainly a good return on investment for the community.
Thank you, Your Worship. Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? None opposed, that carries. Moving on to item 5.5, $24,350 for community events. Comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? None opposed, that carries. Moving on to item 5.6, $690,044 for the EDTC, including a $25,000 special grant. Any comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? None opposed, that passes. Moving on to item 5.7, $1.470259 for the Fort Erie Public Library. Comments or questions? Councillor McDermott.
Well, of course, I support this evening. I think that this board's a very prudent, fiscally responsible, and proactive board, and I think that this budget is not only fair, but they do such good work in the community, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, Councillor McDermott. Any other comments or questions? I'd just like to echo Councillor McDermott's thoughts and just express my thanks that they do a fantastic job. The people of Black Creek and Stevensville appreciate their work, their efforts, and the time that they're taking to improve the level of service at that branch. And I see with the new bus service, we are getting a few more people through the doors, which will help the utilization rate on that building in that area. So thank you very much. I'll call the question. All those in favor? None opposed. That carries.
Chair, can I move all three of these under part 6?
Certainly, Your Worship.
These are levies by the business
The
improvement
BIAs,
association
certainly, it's all
areas.
the same thing. There's no sense in discussing them individually. So the mayor is moving Part 6 altogether as one, that council approves the following business improvement area levies for 2018 for Bridgeburg Station, Ridgeway BIA, and Crystal Beach BIA. Comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? That passes unanimously. Moving to Part 7. The council approves the town's general levy of $26,720,836, comprised of base budget of $26,087,070 and supplementary budget of $633,767, and directs staff to submit the related bylaw for approval. Can I have a mover? Your worship has moved that. Your worship, you'd like to speak to it?
Yeah, I would like to speak to that because I'd like to go back to where we started this whole discussion about trying to perhaps reduce the levy if possible. And I had questioned Mr. Jansen with respect to the budget relative to planning and development services. And I'm wondering if we can get some comment from Mr. Jansen whether an adjustment to those revenues of a couple $100,000 would be reasonable, would it be prudent, would it be objectionable?
Mr. Jansen?
So we did discuss the risks earlier of the future impacts of raising revenues to a level we don't believe they will be sustained at. In terms of specific adjustments, Mr. Brady may wish to comment on a level that he would be comfortable with based on information he might have.
Mr. Brady?
I think it would be helpful if everyone turned to page 21 in Mr. Jansen's report. That's the one that has planning and development services. Or section 7 in your general levy. Okay. If we look at that line, we look at revenue, there are three avenues that revenue are dealt with in planning and development services. One is fine revenue, the other is grant, and the other is user fees. Fine revenue is that which comes from tickets primarily and other fines that we assess. And you'll note that we have this year, our actuals are about 16,500 based on a budget of 15,000, and we have raised that to 17,500. And given the additional staffing that you've approved today, I suspect that will be a little bit higher, but it's in that range. The grants, we have $232,000 that have come in actual grants this year. Those have to do with grants primarily from the region. We're not anticipating the same level of grant structures in the years to come, unless there's some program that comes up that we're not aware of. The third line is user fees, and user fees is planning and building services fees, and those have to do with building permits and have to do with planning approvals. And as you can see, this year my staff have been very busy because they've had 1.274 in terms of user fees as compared to approved budget. We've raised that significantly for 2018 to 889,000. And while I anticipate that building permit fees will go back up next year in terms of the number of fees, number of applications, I don't anticipate that planning will continue at the accelerated rate that it is. And if it does, I'll be coming back to speak to you about additional staffing because it's been the last 2 years have been quite exceptional. So if you look at the 889,000 and compare it to the 1.2 in actuals, you'll see that there is about $274,000 worth of room. That would be the absolute maximum that I would suggest that you may want to consider. If you do, please don't be offended next year if there's a deficit in this line.
Your worship.
Well, I'm not actually thinking of offsetting that entirely. I'm just looking at something that's perhaps more reflective of what's actually going to happen. And I can appreciate that any adjustment we make here may have an impact on next year's budget if the numbers were to fluctuate. But $374,000 is actually the difference between what's being budgeted and what was received last year. I'm wondering what Mr. Jansen's comfort level is with a couple of $100,000, number one, and number two. What would a couple $100,000 do in terms of our tax change projections?
Mr. Jansen.
So comfort-wise, I think, given Mr. Brady's comments on the fact that it is exceptional, I think we may want to consider, first of all, your second question is in terms of what the impacts are. Should there be some sort of number or range in mind the council has, and then we can try and work back a bit from that. In general, with our budget being approximately just over $25 million, 1% is about $250,000. So keep that in mind. But clerk, if you don't mind, maybe me being allowed to project to the screen. I don't know if you can do that or if someone else does. Kelly can get me on there. Then I can show you real time what some of these impacts are. So here you can see in real time in our base revenue section for a $100,000 adjustment to these revenues, that would reduce the overall rate by 0.39%, reducing the overall with the approved supplementary levies to 3.54 or 1.30 for the total tax bill. So the other, if you would want to consider approximately 1% here of $250,000.
Let's do 200.
200, yep. $200, so double the effect at 0.79% would bring the overall down to 3.14 or 1.12%. Yeah, I know from having looked earlier, $250,000 reduction would bring it down to 2.95, I believe it was. So that's the magnitude or the impact of that change. $200,000 would bring it down to 3.14 or 1.12 total.
I asked Mr. Jansen then about the first question. How does he feel about a $200,000 adjustment with respect to the revenues on this?
Certainly.
I think given our year-to-date actuals, although I don't think it's true on the building permit and other development-related fees, I know there are still some adjustments to be made in the 2017 column. For example, that grant from the region is monies we've received, but it's not ours to keep. That'll be paid out yet. So there are some adjustments like that still to be seen in our 17 year-end adjustments. So There is room to do that. As I mentioned, it does defer the risk down the road, so to speak, should those revenues be brought down. But 200,000 would seem to be supported based on what we've seen in the last 2 years.
Your worship.
So then, if I might, Mr. Chair, Mr. Jansen, then to make that adjustment, what would the appropriate wording then for Part 7 be? That it be a levy $200,000 less than that amount?
That's correct. That it would just reduce both of those because it's in the base component as well. It would reduce the general levy of $26,520,837, comprised of base budget of $25,887,070, and so on.
I'd like to move that, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so just to bring everybody up to speed, the mayor's proposing an amendment to Part 7. Just get back to that screen. Okay, so Part 7 would then read, the council approves the general levy of $26,520,837, comprised of the base budget of $25,887, and what were the rest, because you just said change? $70. Sorry, $25,887,070. And a supplementary budget of $633,767, and direct staff to submit the related bylaw for approval. The mayor's amendment is on the floor. Comments or questions? Councilor Passero?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm fully supportive. As the chair of PDS, I just want to make a comment that this is money being brought in through the hard work of the PDS staff, and I'd like to monitor that workload very closely as we go out throughout the year, and so council is not surprised if there is at some point over the next few months a budget amendment as far as some staffing, if the numbers continue to roll in like they are, because they really were pushed to the brink as far as what they were able to do to get that revenue. And given that a large portion of that revenue was a couple of large projects that we may or may not see going into the future, yes, it does bring in a bigger chunk, but it also requires a lot more time and resources on their part. So it's great to do this. I'm supportive of the end result, but let's just keep in mind that these are real people doing real work to bring in real dollars, and we need to be cognizant of ensuring that that workload doesn't exceed the resources they have to deliver. Thank you.
Are there any other comments or questions on the mayor's amendment?
If I may, can you just
Yes.
clarify what the amendment is, and just wondering if it's specific enough to how it's being the levy reduction is being accomplished?
So we've simply changed the numbers. The first number is $26,520,837, which affects a $200,000 reduction in the levy required, and that corresponds with adding $200,000 to the revenues for user fees that are expected from planning and development services. Is that adequate for your purposes?
Are there any other questions or comments? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor of the mayor's amendment? That passes. None opposed. So now we'll vote on the Part 7 as amended, that council approves the town's general levy of $26,520,837, comprised of the base budget of $25,887,070, and a supplementary budget of $633,767, and direct staff to submit the related bylaw for approval. Comments or questions on the motion as amended for Part 7? Councilor Passero?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a note on something that wasn't included in the budget and why. Council had passed a resolution supporting a process to replace the Kinsman Pool, and in conversation with PDS staff, They've determined that because it's going towards a capital project, that money can be taken 90% of the value from DC charges. So that's why it hasn't been brought forward. So there's no hit to any of the rates going forward. So that'll be brought forward in the next month or two ahead to start that off. And I'm going to go out to the community and see if I can source the other 10% to make that happen. So that's why that's not in there. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Passero. Any other comments or questions? Okay, seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor of Part 7 as amended? None opposed, that carries. We'll now move to Part 8. That council excludes capital asset amortization of $5,914,400 from the 2018 general levy operating budget. Moved by Councillor McDermott. Comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? None opposed, that carries. And I will pass the chair back to his worship.
Thank you very much, Councillor Nutt. Very well-run meeting and very positive results. Since you've handed the chair back to me, that means that you're available to adjourn this meeting because there will be no need for a meeting next Wednesday. So, Councillor Nutt, would you please move to adjourn?
Certainly, your worship. That the Town of Fort Erie Budget Committee meeting hereby adjourned at 8:06 p.m.
All those in favor? That is unanimous. Thank you.